Welcome to the Story Nebula. This campfire story follows Sarah in the Trail Marker, an Appalachian nightmare. Hit like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments.
The Trail Marker. Sarah had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 3 weeks when she first noticed the strange markings. They weren't the standard white blazes that mark the official trail, nor were they the blue ones marking side trails. These were different. Crude symbols carved deep into tree bark, looking almost like ancient runes. At first, she dismissed them as the work of other hikers or maybe local kids messing around. The trail saw thousands of visitors each year, after all. But as the sun began to set on her 19th day of solo hiking, she noticed something odd about their placement. They seemed to form a pattern, leading away from the main trail toward an unmarked path she couldn't find on any of her maps. The sensible thing would have been to ignore them and continue to the next shelter. She had maybe an hour of daylight left, and the October air was growing colder. But Sarah had always prided herself on her navigation skills and outdoor experience. After graduating from her park ranger training, she'd handled everything from lost hikers to aggressive wildlife. Whatever lay at the end of those markings, she felt equipped to handle it. Following the symbols led her down an overgrown path that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The trees grew closer together here, their branches intertwining to block out most of the remaining daylight. The air felt different too, stagnant, with an odd, metallic smell she couldn't quite place. After about 20 minutes of careful hiking, she emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood what appeared to be an old ranger station, its walls weathered gray with age. The windows were boarded up and vines had claimed most of the structure, but the door looked surprisingly intact. More of those strange symbols had been carved around the doorframe. Sarah checked her phone. No signal, as expected this deep in the wilderness. She pulled out her flashlight and checked her watch. She still had enough time to make it back to the main trail before complete darkness, if she turned around now. But something about this place tugged at her professional curiosity. If this was an abandoned ranger station, it should have been in the park service records. But she'd never seen it documented anywhere. The door creaked open with surprising ease. The interior was a single room, mostly empty except for an old desk and what looked like a ham radio setup covered in dust. But it was the walls that caught her attention. They were covered in the same symbols she'd seen on the trees, hundreds of them, arranged in intricate patterns that seemed to spiral toward the center of the ceiling. As she moved her flashlight beam across the walls, she noticed something else. The symbols weren't carved here. They appeared to be burned into the wood, the edges of each mark blackened and crisp, and they looked fresher than the ones outside, almost as if... A loud crack from behind made her spin around. The door had swung shut, though she hadn't felt any breeze. When she tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. The metallic smell was stronger now, and she realized with growing horror what it reminded her of the copper scent of blood. Her flashlight beam caught something moving in the corner of the room. At first, she thought it was just shadows playing tricks on her eyes. But then she saw it clearly. The symbols on the walls were changing. The burned marks were shifting, rearranging themselves like black mercury flowing across the wood. A low hum filled the air, and the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. Sarah could see her breath now, as she frantically tried the door again. The radio on the desk crackled to life, emitting bursts of static interspersed with what sounded like whispered words in a language she didn't recognize. The shadows in the corners of the room began to deepen and move, taking on shapes that shouldn't have been possible. Her flashlight beam seemed to bend around them, unable to penetrate their impossible darkness. The humming grew louder, and she could feel it in her teeth, in her bones. That's when she heard the footsteps on the roof. They moved with deliberate slowness, each step making the old boards creak. They crossed to the center of the roof, directly above the point where all the symbols seemed to converge. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, trying to control her panicked breathing. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment everything was silent. Then the ceiling began to bleed. Dark liquid seeped through the wooden boards, but it didn't fall. Instead, it crawled across the ceiling, following the pattern of the symbols. As it reached each mark, the symbol began to glow with a sickly green light. The whispers from the radio grew louder, more urgent. Sarah's training kicked in through her fear. She pulled her emergency flare from her pack and ignited it, hoping the bright light would help. The red glare filled the room, and for a split second, she saw something in the shadows, something that couldn't exist in any rational world. The sight of it made her mind recoil, unable to process what her eyes were telling her. The flare light seemed to aggravate whatever was in the room with her. The shadows writhed, and the humming turned into a high-pitched whine that made her head spin. The liquid on the ceiling began to move faster, the symbols pulsing with increasing intensity. Desperation! She kicked the door with all her strength. It burst open with a crash, and she bolted out into the clearing. The sun had set, but a full moon provided enough light for her to run. She didn't stop until she reached the main trail, her lungs burning and legs shaking. When she finally caught her breath and looked back, the path she'd followed was gone. Where the overgrown trail had been, there was only dense forest, as if the path had never existed at all. Sarah made it to the next shelter just before midnight. She found 2 other hikers there and spent the night close to their fire, jumping at every sound from the darkness beyond the shelter's walls. In the morning, she reported the incident to the Park Service, but when a search team went to investigate, they found nothing. No station, no symbols, no evidence that anything had ever been there. But the strange markings didn't stop. Over the next few years, similar symbols began appearing on trees along different sections of the Appalachian Trail. Hikers reported finding them just off the main path, always leading somewhere just out of sight. Some tried to follow them. Not all came back. The Park Service eventually put up warning signs, telling hikers to stick to marked trails. They said it was because of dangerous terrain and wildlife. But Sarah knew the truth. She'd seen what waited at the end of those symbols, in that impossible room where shadows moved wrong and reality seemed to bleed. Sometimes on cold nights, when the wind blows just right, she swears she can still hear that radio crackling, still catch whispers of that unknown language. And sometimes when she closes her eyes, she sees those symbols shifting and changing, trying to tell her something she doesn't want to understand. These days, she warns every hiker she meets. If you're on the trail and see strange markings on the trees, markings that seem to want to lead you somewhere, don't follow them. No matter how curious you are, no matter how experienced you might be. Because whatever left those symbols isn't interested in showing you the way. It's interested in showing you something else entirely. Something that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. And if you hear that humming, that bone-deep vibration that makes your teeth ache and your thoughts scatter, run. Run as fast as you can back to the main trail. Don't look back. Don't try to understand. Just run. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the wilderness isn't what you can see. It's what you can almost see. The things that wait just at the edge of comprehension, scratching at the borders of our reality, leaving their marks and waiting for someone curious enough or foolish enough to follow them into the darkness. Sarah still hikes the Appalachian Trail. She says she needs to warn others, to keep them safe. But some who know her story wonder if she's really looking for something else. If part of her wants to find those symbols again, to understand what she saw in that room. Because once you've glimpsed behind the veil of reality, it's hard to pretend you don't know what's lurking there. So if you're ever hiking the trail and you see strange markings on the trees, just keep walking, keep to the path, and whatever you do, don't follow the trail markers that shouldn't be there, because sometimes they follow you back.
Thanks for watching the story Nebula. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more captivating tales. Leave your thoughts and story ideas in the comments below. Until next time, keep your imagination soaring